Radio with no age restriction. Kingfisher FM.
Now, you know that we had the State of the Nation address from our president last week, and I'd love to invite Craig Bailie, a political analyst from East London, to Kingfisher FM. Hello, Craig.
Jan, good morning, and thank you for having me.
So good. So Craig, you're based in East London, but clearly you have your finger on the pulse. Tell me, what is it that we get to take away from the President's State of the Nation address last week? What are the main things we get to take away as South Africans?
Sure. Jan, I think maybe in following the President's example, it's important to first acknowledge the tributes that he gave our fallen soldiers in the DRC.
Sure, that's good.
14 of them in total. So I really appreciated that the President started his address with that. Strictly speaking, he didn't start it with that tribute. It came second after he welcomed the dignitaries. And I think it would have been a welcome break with tradition if he, in fact, first paid tribute to those fallen soldiers.
Yes.
And perhaps also, it would have been nice to hear a moment's silence. Nevertheless, I think it's important that he mentioned those soldiers.
Yeah.
And I think it's still debatable what exactly they died for.
Yeah. But
they died nonetheless. And I think, just because they've offered up their lives, it's important that we give them
the
necessary recognition.
Absolutely.
But before we move to takeaways, if I may just say, I think what one would want ideally from a SONA is three things, at least three things.
Yeah.
First, an outline and an assessment of what's happened.
Yeah.
And what we've achieved since the previous SONA. Secondly, a vision of where we want to be.
Yeah.
And thirdly, a plan of how we're going to fulfill that vision.
Yeah.
And I myself have now referred to we 3 times.
Yes.
And anyone who was listening carefully would have heard the President say we constantly.
Yes.
Now the critical thinker has to ask, who is we?
Right.
Is it the GNU? Is it the ANC, a party, a member party of the GNU? I think from the President's perspective, from a leadership perspective, when the listener or those watching the SONA last week heard him say we, ideally he would have wanted us to see ourselves as part of that group, as the South African nation.
Yes.
And I think a key, or at least a golden thread running throughout his address was this idea, this notion of unity.
Yeah.
Which I think in and of itself is not a bad thing. In fact, it's a good thing. It's a desirable thing. This is something we want leaders to talk about and aspire to. But I think what brings this notion of national unity into question is whether the realities align with the way in which the President spoke about unity.
Yeah.
So we have a question here about whether this was rhetoric or was it real.
Yeah.
And there's no doubt in my mind that there's at least some part of our President who desires unity.
Yeah,
but the question is whether he and his political colleagues are governing in a manner that encourages that unity.
Yeah.
And I think just the fact that, we had some civil society organizations run off to a foreign leader, if I may put it in those terms,
yeah,
that in and of itself questions this notion of unity.
Yeah.
Why did they feel that to run beyond our borders to go and have a conversation about land reform?
Yeah.
But perhaps I'm veering off topic. I think it's
That's
just
a good question.
To orientate the listeners.
Yeah.
Those are three things that we ideally want to hear from the SONA. I think the President did well with the second of those, the vision casting.
Yes.
But I think he failed with what have we achieved since last year, and how are we going to fulfill this vision that I've said before you.
Yeah.
And anyone who listened to the post-SONA commentary would have gathered that. One of the SABC commentators said a lot of the issues spoken about sounding all too familiar. We had Julius Malema of the EFF saying he's not the man who follows through what he committed during the State of the Nation address. That's referring to last year.
Yeah.
And furthermore, Mr. Malema asked for concrete plans. We heard something similar from Musi Memane of Bosa, who asked for deliberate action.
Yeah.
And Nhlamulo Ndlela, the national spokesperson of the MK party, said you can't even refer to it as a plan. And lastly, then ATM leader Vuyo Wetu Zungula asked for more accountability in terms of what he said would be delivered at previous SONA. So there's this general perception that there's a misalignment between what's being said and the actions or inactions that we are seeing across the nation.
So Craig, maybe I can ask you a little bit, because I think, this whole idea of, government of national unity, it's the first year that they've had to kind of have this opportunity to actually work together. And you kind of wonder, so how is that, how do you think that is working? Because, if what the president promises, that's now also not just on the ANC anymore. There's a collective.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think last year's SONA obviously would have taken place, before the elections, before the founding and establishment of the GNU. So to a degree, if the president had spoken about what we have achieved, let's assume the we is government.
Yes.
A significant portion of that would have been what we as the ANC-led governments have achieved.
Yes, okay.
Because we have to kind of look at it from the perspective of momentum from, before the GNU. That said, I think when it comes to leading diversity, as much as diversity can be, and should be seen as a positive.
Yeah.
The challenge with leadership is getting everyone onto the same page and having everyone move in the same direction. And I think that's always going to be a challenge in a country as diverse as South Africa.
100%.
I think maybe from a comparative perspective, something we should be positive about is I don't think we're close to being as divided as a country as as the Americans are today.
True story. Yes, I agree with that.
I think that's something to celebrate, and we need to ask ourselves, how can we build on the commonalities that we currently share?
Yeah.
And in the president's defense, I think he was trying to do that, but the critical question is, was it more rhetoric? And if we look at, what has come before the SONA, how much value, how much hope, how much encouragement can we take from that rhetoric, given what we've seen?
Yeah. So Craig, we are people of faith. We believe that Jesus is on the throne. I keep saying, don't forget, Jesus is on the throne,
Yes.
But what does it look like for the everyday, what do we take away for the everyday person who wants to build, but isn't sure, sometimes we get blindsided by all the things that are wrong or all the things that aren't working. What hope does this SONA give us for our future?
Yeah, and I think it would have given us a lot more hope had it not been for that disconnect between the president's words and the actions we are seeing on the part of government. I don't think we can deny that disconnect.
Yeah.
But I think as Christians, it's vitally important that we see all of this in perspective. That
yes.
God is, as you said, God is sovereign.
Yes.
Ultimately, He's in control. And I think we need to work from that perspective. I'm someone who, I've said in the past, if we're ever forced to immigrate, I hope that we are able to go to another African country.
Yeah.
Because I love Africa, I love its people. But I want to stay here.
Yes.
I want to stay in South Africa.
Yes.
And I think what we as Christians need to do, to ask ourselves, is how do we help create a nation where that is possible?
Yeah.
Where we not only want to stay, but we're also able to stay.
Yeah.
And prayer certainly is important. And I just looked up, 1 Timothy 2 verse 1 to 2 again this morning. The instruction we're given to pray for those in authority.
Yeah.
As much as prayer is important, we cannot negate the need to take action.
Yeah.
And I think already now we need to start, not just Christians, but all South Africans, we need to ask, how do we intend to vote during the next elections?
Yeah.
How do we encourage one another, firstly, to pitch up and vote?
Yes.
And secondly, from a Christian perspective, how do we vote according to biblical principles and values? And that work needs to start yesterday.
Yeah.
Because it's within the church, part of what I call holistic discipleship. Just like it's no longer good enough to talk only about Christians. We have to talk about born again, saved Christians.
Yeah.
Because these words have lost their meaning. They've been watered down. And so holistic discipleship is taking what we were instructed to do in the Great Commission and including in Christ's teachings. We have to ask ourselves, how do we as Christians relate to the political space? And I believe Scripture gives us the tools to do just that.
For sure.
To do it in a way that benefits our fellow citizens, in a way that gives God glory, and even in a way that allows the existing government or any government that happens to be in power to feel supported by the church. Even if that support has to include accountability.
Yeah, I agree. Sure, that's so powerful. Craig, your lasting thoughts around this for today?
I think that would probably be the most important thing that I would share is the need for the church to take action.
Yeah.
I consider it a blessing that I happened to come to the faith while I was studying politics.
Okay, that must have been interesting.
I was confronted with this question of, well, what does a Christian look like who's involved with politics or has some view on politics? What should this Christian look like?
Yeah.
And since that journey began, within the circles I've moved in, these circles extend beyond our own country's borders. I often hear Christians talking about politics as a dirty business. To a degree, there's a lot of truth there. But then they also say, because of this, I'm now going to remain disengaged or keep my distance from the political space.
Sure.
And I think that's where we're getting it wrong.
That's it.
If we believe something is dirty, we're using simple terms here.
Yeah.
How do we fix it?
Yeah.
We have to engage that space. We have to be involved.
Yes.
And very importantly, we have to be involved in a manner that aligns with God's truth, that gives Him glory, and that shows love towards our neighbors.
Yes. That's so good. Craig Bailie, thank you so much for your time all the way from East London. Good to have you on air with us. Thank you.
103.8 and 107.5 FM. Faith-filled frequencies.